person. Being the person that turns up to support, being the person that turns up to help without ever having to be asked. And we're talking about that because we believe that the church should be the second person. We believe that the church should be the second person that's actively working to do something in particular, that's actively working to lighten the load. Lighten the load that people are carrying. And so we are in week 5 of this series called The Church Is. And the reason that we're doing it and talking about it is because both inside and outside the church is a misunderstanding of what the church is and the purpose of the church. And we can't really completely work on how the community outside see us, but what we can do is talk to us here and try and tidy up some of that misunderstanding of what the church is and why the church exists. And so over the last 5 weeks, this is what I've put together to try and unpack it in a timely manner, because 5 weeks trying to unpack that's difficult in keeping the time. So this is ultimately what we talked about over the last 5 weeks, that the church is a movement, not a destination. It's about working and serving together, not just showing up. The church is about true acceptance, not just being friendly. Like, this is what the church is supposed to be about. The church is, and ultimately the church is this, which isn't written there, but we've talked about it and it's been the undercurrent throughout the series. The church isn't the building. The church isn't an event. The church isn't 10:30 on a Sunday morning. The church isn't 6 p.m. on a Sunday evening. The church isn't a particular time. The church is us. The church is the people. And the people are this. The people are a movement. And we're meant to be moving a movement. It's not about arriving at a destination. We're meant to be doing this, about working and serving together. And we're meant to be doing this. We're meant to be actively accepting people, not just being friendly with people. And the thing that I want to drill down on this morning is this thought that the church is supposed to lighten the load rather than add to the weight. The church is supposed to lighten the load rather than add to the weight. Just like that question that I started with, the one that points their finger and says, this is what you're not good at. This is what's wrong in your life. This is ... This is what's bad about you. All they've done is added to the weight, right? But that person, that second person that turned up and said, I'm going to serve without being asked, is a person that actively works to lighten the load. There's this story in John 7. It starts in John 7. We're coming to the end of John 7 where we're going to jump into it and then move into the chapter 8. But effectively what happens in John 7 is Jesus, he makes a pilgrimage from where he is to Jerusalem to take part in this religious festival the Jews had done for generations. It's called the Feast of Tabernacles. And the Feast of Tabernacles was this celebration that they'd take part in that was ultimately them celebrating God's provision of the past. And it started with God's provision from freeing them from slavery in Egypt, which you can read about from the book of Exodus onwards, where God sets them free from the... Yeah, that's right. I'm not even going to go. I'm going to derail us, so I'll keep going. And so they're celebrating this. But they're also celebrating what God's done that previous year, the provision of God for that previous year, and believing that God is going to turn up again in the year to come. And part of the custom was this, that they wouldn't have this celebration just in their own communities. They'd all have to gather to Jerusalem to celebrate. And it was a week-long festival that they'll turn up from everywhere to Jerusalem and have this major celebration. And this celebration had dancing, it had singing, it had shouting, they would wave palm leaves and willow branches and all these different things. There'd be singing, there'd be entertainment, there'd be feasting with food, there'd be drinking. It was a celebration that went for a week. And so Jesus, he makes this pilgrimage to this place, like to Jerusalem, to be a part of the celebration, to be a part of this festival. And there's this central thing that we miss sometimes when we talk about this festival. And like the pinnacle of this festival was this thing called the water pouring ceremony. And it was like the pinnacle of it because the noise got enormous around this time. In fact, a lot of the Jewish rabbis would say that if you've never experienced a celebration of the water pouring festival, you've never experienced joy. And the water pouring ceremony is what would happen, like the priest would go and scoop some water out of the well, and they would march it up the stairs, and then in front of everyone, they would pour the pitcher of water out. And the idea was this: when they scooped it up, they were scooping up of God's provision from rain from last year. And they were scooping that up, and then they were bringing it in front of everyone. And then when they poured it out, it was figuratively saying, we are believing that God is going to provide for us again this year. We're believing that God's going to come and refresh us again this year. We're going to believe that God is going to be with us again this year. We're believing in God's provision. And the thing with this, it was the climax of the festival. And the noise would get monstrous. And so as the priest is like carrying the pitcher of water up, the celebration would get louder and louder and louder, and the singing and the shouting. And they'd all have palm leaves. Has anyone had a palm leaf and shaken it? It makes noise. You can imagine tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of people gathered together. Willow branches, palm leaves, singing, shouting, dancing, shaking these things. The noise could be heard from miles around everywhere. And then what would happen is that the noise would get louder as the priest was carrying it up. And then just as the priest started pouring it, just as the water started coming out, everything would go completely silent. Tens upon tens of thousands of people went from noise to silence, out of reverence of this is what God provided us last year, and we're believing that he's going to refresh us again this year, which is kind of really important for the thing that Jesus does. Because right here is where Jesus makes a really bold statement about who he is, what he wants to do, and what it is that he expects his church, his people, to carry out. And it's this: on the last day, the climax of the festival, this is the water pouring ceremony. The priests are carrying the pitcher up in front of the crowds, and it is noisy. It's chaos. There's singing, there's shouting, there's dancing, there's noise. And then just as the drops of water start coming out, everyone goes completely silent. And this is what theologians wrestle with, and this is their thought, that is that right at this point, at the climax of the festival, Jesus stood up. And it's at this point, because this is the only time in the festival when everyone's gathered together and everyone would have been quiet enough to be able to hear Jesus say these next couple of words. Everyone's gone dead silent under the reverence of what's happening. And Jesus stands up and he shouted to the crowds and he says, anyone who is thirsty may come to me. Highlighting it. And what he's ultimately saying is, he's saying, you're looking at the provision of God last year and believing and wanting and praying and hoping that God's going to come and provide and refresh you again this year. But I want you all to know, while you are silent watching this, that if you come to me, the thing that you want, that you're wanting, that you're expecting, that you're believing out of that pouring, that is found here in me. Anyone who is thirsty may come to me. Anyone, he says, who believes in me may come and drink. For the scriptures, he says, for the scriptures declare rivers of living water will flow from his heart. And ultimately, what Jesus is saying is that the church is supposed to be refreshing. But not only that, what he's saying is, if you come to me, I will refresh you. If you come to me, I'll refresh you. This desire, this wanting that you're expecting God to pour something out. If you come to me, I will refresh you. I'll give the thing that you're praying for, hoping for, believing for. That's found in me. But the thing that he says afterwards, rivers of living water will flow from them. What he's doing, what he's highlighting is this. If you come to me, I'll refresh you. But here's the expectation. And he's foreshadowing what was coming, which was the Holy Spirit that we read about in Acts chapter 2, the pouring out of the Holy Spirit, which is this: if you come to me, rivers, I'll give you the living water that you want, but I'm going to overflow you so much that living water is going to flow out of you, and you're meant to become a spring of living water to the people that you engage with. Meaning this, that I am flowing out of you so much that when people engage you, they can't help but engage my presence. And you'll be refreshing to them because of the living water that is within you, which is me. And ultimately what he's highlighting, what he's getting at, is that his expectation of the believers or of people or of us, you and I, the church, of what he expected us to be, and that is that he expects us to be refreshing. The church should be this: the most refreshing space for people. The church should be the most refreshing space for people. But like I said at the start, the church isn't 10:30 on a Sunday morning. That's the church, maybe service, that's the gathering of the church. If you go to another church and they've got another service, it's not that time, it's not at 6 p.m., it's not this, it's not like the church isn't that. The church is the people, and so the church being you and I, we should be this. You should be the most refreshing space for people. That when people come into your life, they should feel refreshed by being in your presence. Not drained, not exhausted, not condemned. They should feel refreshed by being in your presence. And that's what Jesus is wanting to outwork, and that's what he's wanting to highlight. And so he stands up in the midst of this festival, and when everyone's silent, he says this. And what happens after that is there's all these conundrums, people asking and wrestling with, who is this person? And it says that some believe who it is that he says that he is. Some believe that he's this Messiah. Some aren't sure. Some are confused. Some don't agree. Other people want him arrested. In fact, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they don't want him there, and they've been trying to arrest him and find him and hunt him down the entire festival. They sent people out to arrest him, and they couldn't get him arrested. And what Jesus ends up doing is he escapes. He makes his big, bold statement, and then he leaves. He leaves and he heads to the Mount of Olives. The assumption is he goes there and he prays. But you can imagine tens upon tens of thousands of people, and everyone hears it. You can imagine that night at dinner, the rumor mill. That guy stood up, that Jesus character from Nazareth, that troublemaker, that whatever. Like, he stood up and he said this. Like, what is it that he means? What is it that he's saying? And some believed, and perhaps some didn't. Some were wrestling. Like, what is it that he was saying? And maybe the question was this, like, oh, we believe that. How does that outwork? We believe that he's meant to be refreshing, that he's the refreshing that we're wanting. How does that outwork? We believe that if we engage with him, that same stuff should be flowing out of that. What does that look like? You can imagine that they were wrestling with that. The rumor mill would have been going like, what does that look like? What does it look like, the church being refreshing? What does it look like for us? And so Jesus leaves, but the next morning he turns back up, and what he's going to do when he turns back up, he's going to put the rumor mill to rest as to what it is that it looks like to be refreshed by the King. What it looks like to be people that are refreshing. What it looks like to lighten the load rather than add to the weight. What it looks like to be people that actively attempt consistently to lighten the load. So he's made this big statement. He's gone to the Mount of Olives. And then chapter 8 turns up, and it says this: early the next morning, he was back again at the temple. This is Jesus. He's been up the mountain. Yesterday, this is just not even 24 hours. Yesterday evening, he was at the temple making this big audacious statement. Then he leaves for the Mount of Olives. Then he comes back the next day. He's back at the temple, and it says this: a crowd soon gathered. Why did the crowd gather? The crowd gathered because he just made this statement. And they're wanting to know more. They're wanting to understand. They're wanting to wrestle. They're wanting, like, what does this look like? Jesus, we're intrigued. Have you ever had someone say something to you and something stirs in your spirit where I don't understand that, but something's just connected with me? Sometimes you might have it like I have it a bit through worship songs. I don't know what they're singing about, talking about, but I feel the Spirit of God ministering to me, connecting with me. Or someone says something to you and I don't understand that at that moment, but something shifted in my spirit and I feel the Spirit of God connecting with me. I feel God's wanting to share with me, engage with me, draw something out. And this is what's happened. They heard him say something like, we want to know more. And so he sat down and he begins to teach them. He begins to engage with them. And as he was speaking, the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees, they brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They drag her in front of the crowd in the temple. Everyone's seeing this. Everyone's watching this. They drag her to Jesus and they put her in front of the crowd and they said to Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery, punishable by death according to their law, which they encourage Jesus with. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? Not just 24 hours prior to this, Jesus has said, anyone that comes to me, I'll refresh and I'll make you refreshing. And people are there with Jesus trying to work out, what does this look like to be refreshed by the King? What does it look like to be refreshing to people? What does it look like? And then the Pharisees and the teachers of religious law bring this sinful woman and position her in front of Jesus and ask this question, what are you going to do? Because ultimately they're wanting to trap Jesus at his own game. The question that, to segue quickly, is this: is God more interested in restoring broken people or punishing them? Is God more interested in restoring broken people or punishing them for their sin? Which is exactly pretty well what's happening and what's outworking here. Is God more interested in restoring this broken woman or punishing her for what it is that she is doing? We seem to do something similar to what the Pharisees do. Maybe not you, but the church in general. Christians in general so often end up defaulting towards it, that person's doing that and they're wrong, so they can't be. And it's maybe not, it's a literal stoning, but it's a figurative stoning. And we end up stoning people figuratively because they're doing this. But here's the problem. When we start operating like that, we end up picking and choosing what's right and what's wrong. We become the individual that rests on the judgment seat, so to speak. Because this is what we do. We look at that sin. Sorry, I'm not meaning to point at you, Kate. Chris. We look at that sin over there and we're like, that's really bad. And we don't like it. And perhaps that's our pet sin. That's our pet hate. Chris talked about this a few weeks ago. Our pet sin, our pet disdain. I don't like it. That needs to be dealt with. And then over here, there's this other thing, this other sin that I don't really have a problem with. And we let that go. And maybe it's because I don't have a problem with that, but I do have a problem with that. Or maybe it's because I am doing that, but I'm not doing that. And we end up putting people into categories, and it looks like this. That person can't serve there because that's going on in their life. That person can't be on the stage because of dot. That person can't, and we end up becoming Pharisees and the teachers of religious law, figuratively stoning people based on the sin that we see in their lives rather than being people that are actively trying to refresh them. So the question is God more interested in restoring broken people, or is he more interested in punishing them? And what Jesus is trying to highlight to us through the whole story is that God has this plan, God has this want, this desire to restore broken people to himself. Why? Because the brokenness can't be fixed outside of connection with him. The brokenness can't be fixed outside of connection with him. So he wants to restore them to himself because it's out of that relationship that any brokenness gets healed. And so they were trying to do this. They were trying to trap him into saying something that they could use against him. But Jesus He stooped down in the sand and he started to doodle, started to draw, started to play noughts and crosses. I don't know what it is. There's a multitude of different ideas in church tradition as to what it was he was doing. No one knows. But what we do know is he started drawing in the sand. And they kept demanding an answer like, what do you say? She was caught sinning. She was caught sinning. Interestingly, to note, their pet frustration, their pet sin was when women did something wrong, not when man did. It takes two people to commit adultery. And according to their law, both were required to be put to death. Their pet sin was stoning her, but offering grace to the other one. And they're like, what do you say? What do you say? What do you say we should do? And so Jesus says, all right, this is what we'll do. Let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. Let the one that is perfect start the execution process. Let the one who has never done anything wrong tell them why they shouldn't be in that position. They can't do that. Let them do that. Then he gets back down and he starts writing in the dust again. And when all the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one. Left. Slipped away one by one. Beginning with the oldest until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. In the middle of the crowd with the woman. Something that I actually never noted until this morning, maybe you had, was in my mind, every time I read this story, there was no crowd left. There was just the woman and Jesus. But there was still a crowd left. There was probably three crowds formed. There was one crowd with the Pharisees and the teachers of the religious law wanting to punish, wanting to do all that. There was another crowd that would have formed perhaps in the crowd that was wanting to hear from Jesus, that perhaps turned up as a posse with them, and they were wanting to stone her. And then there was this other crowd that was there still trying to work out what it was that Jesus said the night before and how this outworks. Being refreshing. And that crowd, they've watched the whole thing play out and they're still there. And they hear the next statement from Jesus. Jesus stood up and he said to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? Didn't even one of them?" And she says, "No." And then Jesus says, "Then neither do I. Go and sin. Go and sin no more." So often, the thought is this, three things pop up out of here. There's three parts, just like I talked about. The teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees, they had a fixation. Their fixation was on accusing her. This is what she's done wrong. This is what she hasn't done right. This is why she's disqualified. This is why she's not, like their fixation was on accusing her. Group number one. The second group, the crowd was, as far as not the crowd wanting to hear from Jesus, but the posse that forms, that crowd was wanting to punish her. The crowd's fixation was on wanting to punish her. And then Jesus has a fixation as well. But Jesus' fixation was on restoring her. And the question that I'd ask you is, where's your fixation? When people turn up in your life, when you see people, perceive people, where's your fixation? Accusing, like, that I see that sin's in their life. They can't be doing this, they can't be doing that. And like, I'm going to accuse, I'm going to point out, I'm going to highlight that. Is that your fixation? Or maybe your fixation is like the next step further. Your fixation is wanting to see them punished, wanting to see them removed, wanting to, like, I don't know what it is, but what's your fixation? Because if it's anything other than restoring, I think we're missing completely what it is that Jesus came to do. Jesus came to restore us, all of us, back to the Father. Jesus came to reconcile us to God. Jesus came to restore broken, messy people, sinful people, back into a relationship with God. That's what Jesus came to do. And the pushback that often comes when you read through this passage or scripture or talk about a message like this, perhaps it's got quite a grace bent to it, is this fixation and focus. But Jesus, he still pointed out her sin. He still said, go and sin no more. And we do that, I think, because we've got this fixation on wanting to focus on sin. Fixation on wanting to focus on what's wrong rather than focus on restoration. But my thought is this. What happens if we've got it like backwards? We read a story like this and then we bury down, so to speak, on, but he says, go and sin no more. Part of our job, part of our role is when we're engaging with people that are sinning, that we tell them that they need to go and sin no more. That's our default, constantly back to that. But what happens if we've got that backwards? What happens if we've got that backwards? What happens if it's a bit more like this? What if we made sure that sinful person felt completely, overwhelmingly loved first? Before we make any statement like that. First, before that. Then, when we do talk about the tough stuff, it's coming from a place of love, and it's coming from a place of love that they can trust. That they know that you're a safe place. Because I'm pretty sure Jesus' words to her carried a whole lot more weight at the end after he had publicly fought for her restoration. Right? The church is supposed to be helping people that are burdened. The church is supposed to be refreshing. The church is supposed to be helping restore people to Jesus. The church is supposed to be lifting the load, not adding to it, not adding to the weight. Perhaps the thought is this: it's not about ignoring the sin, it's about prioritizing the person. It's not about ignoring sin. Sin's horrid. Sin destroys. Sin corrupts. Sin wrecks marriages. Sin wrecks families. Sin wrecks lives. Sin wrecks communities. Sin wrecks relationships between friends. Sin destroys. It destroys souls. Sin is horrid, but it's not about ignoring it. It's about rather prioritizing the person and focusing on them and loving them, so that when we have that conversation, they know that I'm not out to condemn them. They know that I'm not out to accuse them, to punish them. They know that I'm wanting the best for them, that I want to see the best possible outcome for them, and that can only ever be found through a relationship with Jesus. Through a relationship with Jesus. Here's the thought. Don't add to the burden. Be the solution. Don't add to the burden that people are carrying. Be a part of the solution that's meant to be refreshing. The church should lighten the load, not add. Not add to the weight. Not add to the weight. The church is supposed to lighten the load, not add to the weight. To explain this, and I'll finish in a second. There's this story that I read quite some time ago, and the story was of this sex worker in Amsterdam. She came to salvation. She discovered Jesus, but she was torn in a wrestling match. And the wrestling match that she was torn in, she was working as a sex worker, and she came to a relationship with Jesus, realized that I didn't want to do that, but had no other means of providing for a family at the time, because she was a single mom. And so for a period of time, she kept working as a sex worker. And this is what we so often do. If we hear a story like that, or someone like that walks in, the black and white side of us turn up, and we're like, you know what, you cannot do that anymore. You become a Christian, you can't live like that. That's not right. That's not healthy. That's not good. And you know what, I completely agree. That lifestyle, that isn't wholesome, it isn't good, it isn't healthy. Completely agree with that. But when we take a clean, black and white approach, we end up just adding to the load. We end up being that person at the start of the story that I started with, that point out the wrongs and then just leave. And the church has been so good at that for so long, pointing out the wrongs in a person and then leave, and not journeying through the mess and through the brokenness and through the chaos. We need to get better at that. We need to get so much better at that. Instead of like when we have someone like that come, we're like, you can't do that anymore. That's not how you should live. That's not how you should interact, and then just leave. Why don't we have another conversation? Hey, can I help you put together a resume? Can I help find you somewhere to live? Can I introduce you to some business owners that I think are looking for workers? Hey, I've got a spare place here. Do you and the kids want to come and stay while we work this out? Can I buy you some groceries? We take this hard, black and white stance, and perhaps rightly so, because we're meant to be against sin, and I completely agree with that. But not at the expense of adding to the weight. We're meant to lighten the load. Pointing the finger and leaving never lightens the load. It only ever adds to the weight. And so perhaps what we can do, we can become people that ask this question: how can I help? How can I help lighten your load? And this is what I want you to do this week. Find someone. Find someone in your life struggling. Find someone in your life that you can see that they're carrying a load. Maybe it's someone that you notice here. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's the sin that you see in their life, so to speak, but it's not about pointing it out. It's about asking the question, how can I help? How can I serve? How can I love? How can I make you feel valued? How can I refresh you? And if you don't know how to do it, here's some thoughts. Listen first. Take them out for coffee. Invite them around for dinner. Listen to their story. Solve second. You know what happens most of the time? You hear the story or the introduction to the story. I do this. I hear the introduction to the story and I already know how to fix their problem. And then you insert how they should fix their problem. And then at some point you hear the rest of the story and like, I was an idiot. That was not helpful at all. Listen first. Solve second. Encourage more, critique less. Oh, but I've got constructive criticism. I don't care if you haven't been leading with encouragement. Encourage first. Find ways. I think it's Hebrews 10:24. Let us stir up one another to acts of love and good deeds. Like find ways to encourage people. Show up when it matters. Actively turn up, actively show up. She's fine. Show up when it matters. Be deliberate. And you know what? Showing up when it matters will always be the most inconvenient moment for you. But that's the very moment that they need you to turn up. Show up when it matters. And then do this. Offer grace, not pressure. I see that sin that you got in your life. I want to extend grace to you, not pressure. I'm not going to pressure you into that at the moment because we want to go on a journey with you together. Be deliberate at lightening the load. Be deliberate at lightening the load that people are carrying. Be deliberate about being the most refreshing example of Jesus you can be. My last thoughts are this. This week, you're going to have a choice. Everyone say this. I'm going to have a choice. This week, you're going to have a choice. This week, you're going to have a choice. You can choose to point out what's wrong, or you can offer to help and make it right. You can add to someone's burden, or you can help carry it. And here's the question. Which sounds more like Jesus to you? Which sounds more like Jesus to you? If you come to me, I will give you refreshment. Which sounds more like Jesus to you? And then which sounds more like the church that we want to be? A church that's known for our extended finger. Yeah, the pointing finger, not the other finger, Chris. The church that's known for our pointing finger, or the church that's known as the most refreshing place people I've ever engaged with in my life. Let me pray. God, I struggle with this. It's so much easier to be judgmental. I find it so much easier, God, to see what's wrong. I find it so much easier to critique, God, to offer solutions and to solve the problem, God. I find it so much easier to lump pressure on people to change and do whatever. And God, I realize that you want all of us to grow and to change and to become the person that you've called us to be, God, but you are so graceful and you go on the journey with us. And so, Father, I want to pray that you stir up in all of us, myself chiefly, this desire and this outworking of being the extension of you here on earth, God, and being refreshing. That when people come to us, when people come to me, when people engage with us as a church, when people engage with us on Monday after we've been here on Sunday, that they're like, my gosh, you are refreshing. God, I pray that you embolden us enough, Jesus, to want to love people audaciously enough that they can't help but see you. And Jesus, I want to pray that as we do that, I want to pray for the tense relationships that perhaps we've got with some people, God, that just melts off. For our friends and family that perhaps don't know you, God, that it starts building a bridge of connection to you, God. And God, ultimately, that when we do that, we get to be the representation of you to the people around us, and we become a church that is refreshing. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So, what's happening after this? Barbecue. So, whoa. Two things. Up the back. Hannah is up there. There are, if you are new, we have a gift box for you. We just want to say thank you for coming. Thanks for being here. We wanted the opportunity to get to know you if we can, but chiefly, we just want to say thanks for coming. So the other thing is, the cafe will be open for the next 15 minutes. Jump in, flood them with orders right now because they're going to close so we can have the barbecue. The barbecue is normally around there, but this time the barbecue is just out there. So go, engage, connect. We'll see you out there.